Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the structural framing industry. Regardless of how you touch this industry, we're glad you're here. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, I'm Sean Shields, Director of Marketing for SBCA, and I'll be your host for this episode of Component Connection. I'm joined by Greg Greenlee, SBCA's Technical Director. On this episode, we're going to talk about building codes, specifically SBCA's involvement in the 2027 Model Building Code process, and where our industry's desired changes to the next edition of the codes currently stands. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, can we start by talking a little bit about how we approached this year's code cycle?
Yeah, certainly. As you mentioned before, we are currently working on the building code that will be released in 2027. So there are 3-year code cycles that they have. And this process starts almost immediately right after the last one ended. So right in about 2024. And that's about when we started working on it. And the first thing that we would come up with are the list of potential changes we would like to see made. This particular cycle, we focused on changes that may be influenced by the new BCSI 2025 guide that we came out with. The new TPI is in this version of the code. So we just wanted to make sure that the code language in the building code and in the residential building code aligns with what we recommend in BCSI 2025 and TPI 1. And the other part you alluded to is what is really important in developing these code proposals is working with other interested parties, other associations and things like that, discussing the proposals and vetting any concerns well in advance of even submitting the proposed code change. So you want to be able to enter or submit the code change with a pretty good feeling that everyone that would have an interest in it would be on board with what you're trying to pursue.
So, Greg, in this particular case, let's talk about some of the organizations that we approached. Obviously, you mentioned TPI-1. So the Truss Plate Institute was one of the first organizations we went to, right? And sat down with Jay Jones and sort of had a conversation, right?
Yep. And actually, all of the code proposals we did this cycle were joint submittals with SBCA and TPI. Just as a kind of a show that this part of the industry is fully in favor of those. As far as other associations that we reached out and worked with, we reached out to NAHB. Obviously, especially with the residential code, they're a very big player in that market. NCSCA was another big one, and in particular with them, with a lot of the international building code provisions that we had, they were very interested in it. We reached out to the American Wood Council and SFIA, which is the cold form steel industry.
Wow. And so, just to make this crystal clear, we really telegraphed ahead of time, what do we want to try to do? Who do we need to work with? Who do we need to make sure is going to be a yes when we actually get to the code change process? And make sure that, I'm sure that you had lots of conversations with these groups of is there anything that in here that you don't like? Is there anything that needs to be clarified well in advance of actually submitting the proposal to the ICC, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we put together drafts of what we would have liked the language to be, and we sent it to all of these agencies, and we had multiple meetings with them to go over the language. They would highlight areas that they were concerned with, and we would work with them to revise that language and change it to something that was acceptable to them, but most importantly, acceptable to us as well. At the same time, these organizations are also putting together code proposals. So they would share their proposals with us, and we would do the same thing. We would go through, highlight areas where we had concerns or didn't concerns. It's also very effective. We can provide support for a change that they have. So when we do end up going to the code hearings, we can telegraph from a industry standpoint, this is a change that would be for the better.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's where we started. Let's talk a little bit about our goals for the 2027 model code. What did we actually want to change this go around?
Yeah, so the biggest one, as I mentioned, is with the new BCSI 2025. We had some accommodations in there. And then TPI 1, we wanted to make sure that there any references in the code aligned with what we had just published for those two publications. So there were some changes to figures and graphics and tables and things like that. That was kind of one part. The second part of the changes that we wanted to do is there's a lot of references in both the IRC and the IBC as far as quality requirements for metal plate connected wood trusses. And quite frankly, the terminology was just not consistent within the industry, between quality control, quality assurance, and things like that. So we cleaned up a lot of that language just to match actually what's used in the industry as well. And then the third thing, there were some provisions in the code that are just outdated or really weren't relevant anymore. So we just moved to either revise or strike those. So 3 things that we've pretty much looked at.
Okay. And I'm sort of curious, beyond the obvious desire to be in harmony with what's in TPI 1 and what's in BCSI, what's our motivation for wanting to get involved in these code changes? Like, what's the benefit to component manufacturers, to our industry, by doing this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 ways you have to look at it. One is we want to make sure that the current state of practice in our industry is what is represented in the building codes. And we are the people in the best position to make sure that that is what is happening. The second thing we want to make sure is if you aren't involved in this process, you don't have visibility to what potential changes might be coming down that would impact your industry. So you could really get, caught off guard in a rather serious way if you don't participate in the process and see these changes happening. And unfortunately, if you aren't participating and you don't see them happening, it's 3 years between cycles. So it might be a code provision that you are stuck with for at least 3 years. And sometimes it might be longer than that, depending on what the adoption is.
So, Greg, the code adoption process is not a one-step process, is it? There are multiple steps in getting a code change proposal submitted and ultimately through the gauntlet to full approval. Can you walk us a little bit through what that process looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this past cycle, there's been some really pretty dramatic changes into what the process was. Just to maybe step back a little bit, you look at the building code, and it's a little bit like Frankenstein. You have all these industries and organizations coming together and putting together language that needs to work somehow. And, ICC has up to this point done really a pretty good job of taking a lot of varied interests and positions from the industry and coming up with a model code that works. There was some opportunity for improvement in that whole process that they have. So this the current cycle, the new process that they're doing, I mentioned before, it's a 3-year process. And the way it works is you come up with an idea and you submit for a code change. That code change then is put out for public comment. And then it is heard at the first committee action hearing, is what they call it, committee action hearing number 1. Each of the codes has a committee that reviews all of these proposals. So the IRC has a committee, the IBC has a committee, and so on down the line. So you go to the committee action hearing 1, your proposal is introduced, you speak in favor of it, and then people can speak against you. Everything follows Robert's Rules of Order, so it's very organized. You have a limited amount of time to give your position and rebuttal and things like that. And once that back and forth is done, the committee takes it and they say, thumbs up or thumbs down. And if they vote against it, they'll provide a reason why. Sometimes they might just not like some of the terminology or some consistency in the language, and they want you to come back and fix that. Other times they just don't like the proposal. So after committee action hearing 1 is done, depending on if it was approved or disapproved, you can go back and make changes to it and resubmit or propose modifications to that proposal. And then there's a committee action hearing number 2, where you basically go through the same process again. So it's kind of a second chance to clean up this language. And this is the biggest thing that was added in this cycle that wasn't there present or previously, is this committee action hearing number 2. So then the next hearing in the process is what they call the PCH, or the public comment hearing. If your proposal was approved at committee action hearing number 1 or number 2, it's put on the consent agenda. for that. If it was disapproved after committee action hearing number 2, or if it receives public comments, you have to go to the PCH and again kind of defend your proposal or propose changes at that time. After that process, between the consent agenda and then anything else that was brought forth, the voting membership either gives it a thumbs up or thumbs down. We had pretty good luck, so we're on the consent agenda. So everything that we proposed requires a 50% approval. And if it gets that 50% approval, then it's congratulations. It will be included in the next version of the code. So if I want to summarize that whole process, you introduce your proposal. There's 3 groups of hearings that are established: committee action hearing 1, committee action hearing 2, and then there's the public comment hearing. If you survive all 3 of those, then you're part of the code.
And that last part, Greg, is really important. When you say the members vote on it, you need to get over 50%. Who are the members?
So the voting members are building officials, or there's some other select qualified people. But for the most people, they're the building official membership that's involved in the process. And the voting that's done, it's a combination of in-person, or it can be done online as well.
And this isn't just like 10 or 15 people giving it up or down. This is like hundreds, if not thousands, of people spread across the United States who have membership and are able to cast a vote, correct?
Absolutely. And again, this is another one of the improvements of this new process. And, back in the day, it was everyone that was in that room, that's who was voting on it. So it was, limited a little bit more to the people that could make it to the hearings. So now online voting, it really casts a wide net. So there will be a lot. And that being said, that's why it's so important when you go through the process to get the approval of the committee, because I think that voting membership really looks at the recommendation of that committee for guidance as far as what their vote might want to be.
But beyond that, too, I think that's absolutely correct, right? The vote of the committee that has jurisdiction over your code proposals has the most weight. But there is a lot of lobbying that goes on by other organizations. You mentioned NAHB. I mean, I think they're, between them and maybe the fire service are 2 classic organizations that do a great deal of lobbying to building officials, so the voters, about different proposals. And so having groups like that on our side really does help ensure that they're helping to lobby on our behalf once we get to this point in the process, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why, when we first talk about that initial vetting that we did of all these proposals, talking to all those other organizations, that's the type of work that you have to do to make sure you aren't arriving at any of these hearings and having a debate in front of the committee or at that final voting thing. I mean, that's going down that path is almost assured to not have a successful proposal.
Yeah, I mean, SBCA does have a history of maybe not always being 100% successful in this model code change process, but a lot of it comes down to the building those coalitions and really putting forth what we want to do well in advance. But I mean, on the other side of it too, Greg, is like there isn't anything we're putting in there that is particularly controversial, right?
Nothing terribly controversial. Everyone always has their own opinions or approach to, when they review a proposal. Some of them are really straightforward that we did, aligning the requirements in a trust design drawing in the codes to match what's in TPI 1. I don't think no one would ever argue that that is a bad idea. One of the proposals that we had added the requirement for the IRC, when you're building the IRC, that you have to have a quality assurance audit on a regular basis, similar to what's done in the IBC. There's some people that might find that controversial. I think as an industry, we've arrived at the point where we feel that that is in the best interest of our industry to pursue that. But for the most part, the ones that we put forward weren't controversial. Some of them were complicated and difficult to explain and potentially misunderstood. So most of the challenges that we had were really just from a communication standpoint, making sure that our industry partners understood what we were trying to do and the committee understood what we were trying to do.
In the end, you're seeking greater clarity in the building code to ensure there are less complications or less complicated interpretations of the code that affect our industry going forward, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so another good example, one of the proposals we had is there in the IRC right now, there's a section it's titled Limits of Applicability, which is really rather poor name for the title of it. And what it is a provision that was added, I think in 2003, that provided you to design for a reduced snow load in certain situations. And it's a provision that was added, and quite frankly, no one really uses it. The design software that everyone uses doesn't incorporate this provision, so it's there. But the title of it, Limits of Applicability, has commonly been misapplied by either users or building officials. They view it that this was the provision that provided the limits of use for trusses in general, which that isn't the case. It's just a provision that allows you to do a reduced snow load in certain conditions. And that was a difficult message to relay to the committee and other parties that we were working with. One, the code provision itself is very complicated to read. You have to sit there and read it thoroughly. It's long. It's a little difficult to digest. And like I said before, the title is a little misleading. So that one probably took the most work for us as a team to talk to other parties and explain what we were trying to do and what the advantages of it were.
Excellent. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights and providing a full update on where we're at with codes.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine everyone in the world loves to sit around and talk about building codes and things like that. And these hearings, they're long and they're very in-depth and detailed, but it is, fascinating from my perspective, and it's great for us to be able to go through this process and really advocate for our industry and what advantages or changes we could make to help us through that process. I am happy to report that I think we had 8 proposals, and right now all 8 of those are currently on the consent agenda. So we had very good success through Committee Action Hearing 1 and 2, and hope to keep that up through the PCH.
Well, A+ to you and the team, right?
Well, it was definitely a team effort. It's not just myself doing it, but it's a lot of hours by a lot of committees and a lot of people put together. But it's a rewarding process at the end of the day. And I think when 2027 happens and it's all published, we'll be very happy we went through the process.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of SBCA's podcast, Component Connection. If you've enjoyed this episode and found it valuable, please like it and share it with others. Stay up to date and in the know by subscribing to Component Connection on whatever platform you use most.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com.